Okay, I'm going to go through my comments to your video. First, when you started talking about, oh well, no, first lollygag is kind of a girly word, but hey, I love it. Okay, but adapting to the truth, you're like there should only be adapting to the truth. The mind shouldn't adapt. But that's the thing, the truth changes, even if in the whole world you want to say it doesn't change. You can try to make an artificial thing like something that is people need to drink fluids in order to survive. Yeah, but the truth you really are dealing with is this area has no clean water, or this area does, or this area does, but only if you're clever about how you find it. Okay, so those are the truths you adapt to. When we're talking about the brain adapting, it's because you left one area, say there was a political strife and a war, so you left that area and went somewhere else. And then there it's colder, so you have to adapt to the truth that it's colder. So that's what we're talking about. And that moves on to you argued against this freedom of thought stuff, and maybe you're just being contrary because you're talking about freedom of thought issues too. You can deny against it and all the determinism, but you're saying we can suppress. There's some sort of interaction of will. In some sense, you're at the very least a compatibilist, which means sometimes we can just talk about the interaction of will and talk about things as freedom of thought, even if we ultimately think it's not free. That becomes a different logical argument. Okay, so because you were using that as well, that there's a kind of a freedom of thought, and in terms of the freedom, it's no good to say, well, there's limitations, and I got language, and I couldn't have thought if I didn't have these ideas from all these philosophers. True, but I mean, it's like philosophy of art as a philosophy of life. If you're gonna do a painting, you have 5 tubes of paint, and you have a canvas. You're gonna say you're not free to paint what you want because the strokes have to go on the canvas, and they're limited to the 5 colors and what you can mix from that. You're gonna say you don't have freedom. No, you have remaining freedoms. These limits put in place some kind of stricture on what you're going to paint, and within those bounds, if you ignore the part that's free, you could say, "Look, I don't have freedom here." Yeah, that part's not free. You wouldn't call that free, but the part where you can put the strokes anywhere within that area, that's a freedom again. So freedom's never, in my model, total anyway. Okay, so it's a straw man to be talking about a couple things that aren't free and say, see, there's no freedom. Yeah, there is no total freedom, but that realm of freedom still exists. You also said the price is too high for this life, and that look, if that were true, forget the fact that people could commit suicide. Assume they don't want to commit suicide because, like you say, they're addicted. Okay, good defense of that. But that's this whole reproducing in captivity. There's also this idea of death by what they used to call consumption, and just depression, and you stop eating, and you get weak, and you die. People can do that. We are pretty resilient. We keep choosing because I think a lot of people, if you're to analyze it, the human attitude doesn't have to be this way. Lots of animals are sensitive. Take them out of their environment, they die. They don't try to adapt. They don't have programming to adapt. We do adapt. And as a result, it's no surprise that our philosophy is more characterized by our fact, by the fact that we don't think the price is too high because we can wait it out. We can think about the future. We can invest in the future. So it's a problem because, yes, it's living the future, but it's one of the reasons we can survive. I also admit it does lend more credence to your complaints because in terms of getting down to the cockroach world, there is some validity in thinking that humans would go ahead and endure and live in that kind of condition. But I have arguments against that as well, that I don't think that's what would happen. You mentioned that the ape and the reptile will use the brain like a hammer. And that's true, but see, this is where I also believe that the intellect needs to filter, control, duct, affect these things. I think this is like a stack of brains. We get some impulses from the reptile brain, they go through the ape brain, we get impulses there, and then we have this brain at what we'll call the top that can analyze and sort of suppress that or feel the feelings but sort of distance them and say, well, I'm going to spin my wheels, I'm not going to act on them. Meanwhile, your waking dream mind that's thinking about stuff is oh, I'm punching that guy in the face, but you disconnect that from your body so you don't really do it. There's techniques like that because we have the extra circuitry to say, wait, don't send this to the body, this information. Okay. But you can't really say, well, the intellect's always great. No, you know, the Nazis had this intellect thing working. Must analyze. You know, the you know, the religions have an intellectual and philosophical parts. You know, and sometimes it's the ape part that overrules that. Like you said, there were all these educated people fine with slavery, whatever. They'd been able to use their intellect the bad way, the way you're criticizing. I would also criticize, and they've used it to make just weird justifications that sort of justify, say, the ape urges when it should be reforming those urges into something better. Okay, and I think it's the ape urges in the slave, though, that just is not going to give in to that, you know, and rises up. Okay, so sometimes these ape urges are going to still be saving us. And I see it as working together. You know, sometimes you got to let somebody's attacking you, you want to let loose and become that beast, right? So if you can manage it well, then sometimes, you know, I think when you're just lying in the sun at the beach and sort of, wow, this is great and absorbing energy and that feels good, that's what lizards do. That's sort of your lizard brain going, this is good, this is all I want. If that's all we did all our lives, we wouldn't be human. But the fact that we release and funnel that lizard brain behavior sometimes can be good. You know, it's just a matter of the right time and place. As far as the last 100 years doing things amazing with the brain, I would say really, let's go back to your transition species thing. When you're talking about, there's some amazing things that have happened. There's some things going back hundreds of thousands of years that could be considered amazing. When you're talking about the amazing threshold we're waiting for that we would be discussing here, a particular great thing of using our brains intelligently, that hasn't happened yet. Okay, we have wings that we glide a little, we jump and run up the tree and get an extra little puff, but we just don't free fly yet with our brains, okay, as far as I'm concerned. We are a transition species. It's one of the great things about living at this time, though, is we don't know what thresholds we're at, what individuals in the groups might unfold. Since we are transitioning, it means that we're building up to changes that will then appear to happen rapidly. Okay, that's exciting. And you were saying that you use the example of that I had sex with an apple pie and felt that, and so that's good, and that I argued on YouTube and enjoyed that, so that was good, and that this is how I would justify life. And it's sort of true because you use those two things. I'm glad you added in this intellectual, because the enjoyment I get from arguing on YouTube, these feelings of, oh, I see, or oh, I hadn't thought of that, or wow, that's what, you know, those intellectual feelings that I particularly enjoyed. Yes, I'm addicted to them just like these other feelings. You know, it's like I was saying, the enjoyment of the orgasm, though, is more like above the middle, you know, in the halfway above the middle. It's not at the top. Those aren't the most, you know, the whole apple pie thing, as great as it was, is, you know, much lower thing. And I wouldn't necessarily say justifies life. I'd say you can do things like that to just get some more pleasure. But I think this intellectual feeling, which feels more like communing with nature, is much more desirable. And, you know, 10 minutes of that is worth, you know, hours of more easy to get gratification type feelings. You know, and this is the thing. Some feelings are good, and by which I mean that when the feeling feels good, it is good. Like, hey, I'm figuring that out. That's good. Now, sometimes you can fool yourself. You can use your intellect to give yourself an intellectual feeling, and really you're just gratifying. You know, you're being selfish. Hey, I figured out a way to justify my selfishness. I feel intellectually good. Okay, somewhat false, but it's because you're fooling that feeling around. In general, you know, the feeling of figuring stuff out is good, and you do figure stuff out. Okay. The other thing is, I know you like to not count good feelings as an objective good, where bad feelings, suffering, if they're at the level of suffering, are objectively bad. But let's face it, bad feelings are why we're suffering, right? You know, you broke your leg, you have the pain's a bad feeling. That's proving your objective negative there in your system. And good feelings are like further away from suffering. That's why they're good. In your system too, good feelings are objectively good, unless you find a good feeling that is actually suffering, right? But see, the good feelings aren't suffering. There's this